All right, everyone, we're going to pick up the pieces following the Johnson administration and move into the Nixon administration. But when we're thinking about kind of context, and we can think about every subject we go into in a similar way that we would look at any essay prompt or topic that we want to discuss or argue, it's always really important to understand not just what's going on at the time period, but why it's happening or what is it coming off of. So when we're thinking about the years under LBJ, there's kind of that two-headed kind of split. On one side, we have the Great Society, kind of his domestic policies. On the other side is foreign policies. And they're kind of two different stories and splits. And what should be more significant? What should he be remembered by? You can look at the domestic change, right? And you can argue, was it effective? Was it not? Where the impact was felt greater, where it wasn't. You can also talk about the Vietnam War, right? What is going to stand the longer test of time, or what should? And so when we're talking about that, we're going to pick up those pieces going forward. We're really going to bank a lot of this off the Vietnam War because he more has a negative connotation to his presidency, and so we're really going to think of that off the concept of what's happening with the Vietnam War and really the failures that define his presidency. When we're thinking about that, we can also think about some broad objectives for us. We're talking about social change that's going to be happening. There's going to be an anti-government counterculture movement really starting to brew. There is a lot of these different Cold War policies that we can kind of see some invisible lines being drawn. We can go from Truman to Eisenhower to Johnson and Kennedy. We kind of lump together, and then Nixon's going to have his own different take on what to do. We're also going to see kind of how we're going to respond to different issues over time. Nixon will finish the issue with Vietnam, but he'll also take it into a couple different areas. We're going to see some international relations with China, and we'll see it with the Soviet Union. We'll see it with other smaller countries around the world as well. We can also really look at kind of the effects of the Vietnam War here. We've kind of moved way past the causes of it, but the effects of the Vietnam War, how that's going to change foreign policy, how it's going to change the size and scope of the federal government, how that's going to change the public's relationship with the government, and really that debate about how big should the government be, because we've been on this massive trend since FDR in the 1930s, all the way through Johnson, where there's been a steady escalation. Some high points, right, with the Roosevelt administration and with the Johnson administration, huge spikes in that role, but that's been a continual gradual uptick. So now we're going to see kind of the peak of that mountain. And after the Nixon administration, various different reasons why, there's going to be a movement against heightened government control. We'll also see some immigration patterns start to change. So one general trend that we can think about is why is there more immigration coming into this country, how that's going to affect policy, domestic and foreign, and where these sort of values of our country are really being tested and changed, and where we're trying to look at these issues, in what way we're trying to look at these. Finally, looking at kind of our policy towards the environment, the environmentalism movement is really going to pick back up at the end of the 1960s, kind of the aftermath of the 1950s return to massive industrialism. That's where it's really going to be born out of, in the similar way that the conservation or preservation movement came off of the Gilded Age industrialization. We can see that, and then really how this whole period that we've been looking at, period 8, from the end of World War II to where we are now, how has that changed our national identity? How has that changed our view of ourselves and how others view us? All right, so today's focus is all going to be about Nixon. Now, when we talk about Nixon, the first thing that people usually associate with Richard Nixon is the Watergate scandal, but I'm purposely going to leave that for the very, very, very end. And so what we're going to do is we're going to tell the entire story of Richard Nixon without the Watergate scandal as the forefront, and see what your mind is about how successful of a president was he, what things did he accomplish, are these notable changes, and then at the end we'll introduce the Watergate scandal, and then you'll be able to kind of compare and contrast to see really how bad was it, or does the Watergate scandal deserve to overshadow some of the things that Nixon does accomplish. So first, let's start with his election. When we pick up in 1968, there's going to be a couple different things that's going to help shift the balance of power from the Democrats to more traditional Republicans. The two things being, number one, the Vietnam War. not being handled well, very, very contentious issue, and kind of being associated with the Democratic Party. On the other hand of this situation, you also have the Democratic Party that is a little bit in shambles. The incumbent president is refusing to run. He doesn't want to run. They can't decide who they're going to nominate, who's going to be this electable candidate. And so in 1968, the Democratic Party is completely fractured and split. So it doesn't really have a true identity. You're going to have three people sort of running as frontliners. Number one, you're going to have Richard Nixon. He's going to be the Republican candidate. His big pitch is he's going to try to restore order in the United States, that he's the one that's going to bring America back together. You have Hubert Humphrey, the Democrat, who has a lot of anti-war protesters associating him with especially the Johnson administration, but kind of the same old, that we need some change. We need a different type of president who's going to switch how we're handling things. And so he's going to be kind of damned in that right. And then you also have a major third party candidate, the same guy. We've seen his name a couple times, a man by the name of George Wallace. He's a governor from the South, from Alabama. He is heavily opposed to desegregation. He is going to move against any liberal changes, any civil rights movements, heavily opposed. So he is actually going to be more on a re-segregation campaign than a desegregation campaign. So he's the man that's going to run around for a while. He's going to be running for presidency 4 different times, and he actually gains a whole lot of traction. He becomes a very popular candidate, surprisingly, for many voters. But when we're talking about Nixon, the reason Nixon wins and his big philosophy is he's pulling in what he calls the silent majority. It's not this far left radical group, the people that are in the streets protesting, these long-haired hippies, the people that are working 9 to 5, paying their taxes. They're not the ones out in the street protesting. That there's actually a majority of these people in the country. This is the overwhelming sentiment that he is representing those people. The loudest people do not speak for the whole. And so that's kind of Nixon's whole pitch. And it works. Nixon actually does rally a lot of different voters across the country. And this is what the election map is really going to look like. So if you notice, there's 3 different colors on here. We have the blue, very small numbers. You have the red, overwhelming support here, right? He wins over 300 electoral college votes, over 56% of the electoral college votes. So that's doing really well. The other thing is this brown color. That's George Wallace. That's that segregationist, the governor of Alabama. Notice how many electoral college votes he wins. He wins that deep South like pocket. So he is going to win that for sure, right? So he wins 8.4% of the electoral college votes. And add on to that, take a look at the popular vote count over here as well. He wins, right? There's a little slice of the pie. 9.44 million votes, right? He's not just this schlep in the corner. He actually gets a considerable amount of votes. So we have that going for us, right? So there's a lot of different pieces. Understand the social context. Although there are movements towards the civil rights movement, there are massive movements of resistance against it as well. But shifting our focus back to Nixon, Nixon, as we can see, is winning from coast to coast in different spots, in different regions. And the one thing that's really important for this is he really emphasizes and puts a lot of effort into getting votes in the Sunbelt region. The Sunbelt is a region of the United States, and it's not necessarily a term you may have heard, and even if you have heard it, you may not exactly know what it is. There's a few times in U.S. history where we've looked at defining specific regions and what they want. Maybe we're talking about the colonial era, or we're talking, the last time we probably talked about specific regions was maybe like period 4 or 5, when we're talking about the development of certain regions. But when we're talking about the development of the Sun Belt, which kind of happens post World War II, is really where you're going to see it a lot. It's this region that goes all the way across the South. And the reason why I get the name the Sun Belt is because there's a lot more sunlight down there, warmer weather. That's why people would want to move there, nice climate. And it's not just the Southeast, it stretches all the way across from Southern California to the Carolinas, all the way across that belt, that region of the country. And that line, that 37 parallel line, is kind of like the Missouri Compromise line, if you will, that goes all the way across the country. Things you're going to see there, and you think about the causes from World War II, this rapid industrialization, so the defense industry, military bases, tech industries, and even then other things that are not related necessarily to World War II, but retirement, communities, people that move from these areas in the north that are moving down south to find kind of these regions. So the Sun Belt is a big key term. It's one of these terms that's listed in the AP key curriculum. So you'll probably see it in the multiple choice come up. Whether it's the answer or not, you should know what it is. You're going to want to know what it is. So for example, if you're getting a question about something dealing with period 5 or period 6, and you hear the term the Sun Belt, it's not even an intelligent choice for us to consider, and we can eliminate it right away. However, if we're getting something about the mid to later 1900s and we hear the term the Sun Belt, we should probably pay extra special attention to it. But the reason why we're talking about this is there's this massive movement towards conservatism, right? Conservative resurgence that's happening across the country, but especially in the Sun Belt because of the type of people, the old, say, New Yorkers and people from northern Jersey, that urban center, very economically minded, moving down to the south. We're going to see military bases all throughout the South. We're going to see defense industries and tech industries who are getting a lot of their jobs from this conservative legislation all down south. There's going to be a high connection there. The other thing we can think about is we can think about from the other side of the coin is not so much just how many citizens are moving here, but where are they being lost from? You'll notice the dark purple states down here, California, Texas, and Florida being the biggest gains, right? The millions of people, right? How many millions of people they gained, net gain, right? So this is a plus 2 million in Texas, plus 2.3 million in California, plus 3.1 million in Florida. And look at the darker red states where they're losing more from. New York is going to lose a larger portion of their population. Pennsylvania, the old Northwest, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, the old industrial Gilded Age kind of area. That's where a lot of these major factories were. A lot of these factories now are these brand new industries for the modern age are moving down to the southern half of the country, and that's where those workers are going to continue to migrate. It's not so much just international migration, but domestic migration is important as well. So the question is ultimately why go to the Sun Belt? And there's a variety of things, right? There's lower property taxes, there's warmer climate, defense industries, and you're also going to see a lot of immigrants looking for these jobs that are going to fill into a lot of these different industries. Even if it is unskilled labor, there's a lot more opportunities in the similar way that we saw a lot of immigration in the 1800s and early 1900s fled to the Northeast because that's where the factories were. Now their new industries have changed. A lot of these new industries are opening in the South, so that's where the immigration is going to occur. A lot of the people domestically are going to be coming from that region of the Rust Belt. We already looked at this, kind of the old Northwest and the Northeast, and you can even throw in Massachusetts in there a little bit, but not even on the same level as the others. But we're seeing this huge flux going down, and out west. And that's where a lot of population growth is going to be seen. Now, we can talk about big picture stuff. How is that going to impact things? That's going to completely shift the balance of the House of Representatives. 1.5 million people leaving the state of New York and 3.1 million people going to the state of Florida. The Electoral College vote totals are going to completely flip in some areas. It's going to completely change everything. So that's going to impact politics as well. We're going to see different changes in funding, and that's going to be a lot of the domestic effects, but there is going to be international effects with all of these wars that are going on around the world. So we even look at just Korea and Vietnam. There's going to be an influx of immigrants from Asia coming into the country, and also in Central America, South America, some countries in Europe. And this is going to be a constant wave that's going to change the demographics inside the United States. So we have immigration patterns from all over. Mostly this chart is going to tell us domestic, but we can take a look at international migration too. So when we're talking about international immigration, this is kind of like the cop-out answer, the basic answer that you can use almost any single time. There's a reason why people are leaving, right? There's either something pushing them out or something pulling them closer. At the end of the day, they're looking for a better life. The pushes during the kind of the 1900s, this escape from communism and violence and war, right? In the 1800s, we saw things like with the Irish, the potato famine, right? A push out or religious persecution. The pull in this case is this American dream, this idea of prosperity, this opportunity for better jobs. And so we can see that change over time, most definitely. Now, we saw an increase of immigration all throughout the end of the 1800s, heavily in the early 1900s, but by the time we got to the 1920s, after the First World War, we kind of had the Red Scare. There was this crackdown on immigration, and those laws have pretty much stayed place. You can even look at this this graph down here in the lower end of this particular PowerPoint, and you can see that sharp drop because of the immigration laws of the 1920s, and they're going to start to climb back up around the 60s and the 70s. And the reason why is one piece of immigration, the Immigration Act of 1965, is going to eliminate a lot of those quotas from the 1920s. So there's going to be a massive spike and increase in immigration and an increase in cheap labor. So as these industries continue to grow, you have greater work pool there. But as it spikes too high, then there is going to be a movement to crack down on that or to kind of curb or plateau that off. And that's going to come in the mid 1980s. And we're going to be looking at that graph. I'm going to have it zoom in just a second. It's going to put penalties on people that employ immigrants that are undocumented. And it's going to be illegal to grant undocumented immigrants residency. So there are a lot of different layers that are put onto this story that change over time. America's kind of reaction, this pendulum swing. So we can see continuity and change. So there's a little bit of change, then there's a reaction to the change, right? Some things will stand for longer, some things will be shorter. But when we're looking at changes in the modern era and in like the 1900s, we're going to see a massive immigration from our border directly to the south, a lot of Mexican immigration in particular, a little bit of political instability there, but also the rise and prosperity of the United States. People searching for better lives, people are willing to do that, risk that in order to better the lives of themselves and their future children. But the other thing we can look at is we can look at changes over time. So the blue line you're going to see at the top is the percentage that immigrants made up of the US population. The numbers down below is the total number in millions of immigrants. So in the 1920s, right, 19 teens, there's a high percentage, around 14.7% of the American population was immigrant. And then we see after the 1920s down to up to the 1960s, where we're at 5.4 or 4.7%, so very, very low. 1965 comes around, there is a breaking of those quota laws, and you're also going to see a trend uprising in the later decades, and then even an estimate for 2020, 2030, 2040, 2050, and 2060, the amount of immigrants in the country and the percentage of that. But it's a swinging back upward trend we see to modern day. So continuity, we see that steady line down, right? Then some change and some continuity again of that steady increase. So there's going to be this wave of liberalism in the 1960s, I'll talk about in the next video, where there's a counterculture movement of all kinds and kind of trying to shake up the status quo. And that's going to come for all different groups, whether racial, gender, ethnic. It's going to come in policy debates, foreign policy, domestic policy. It'll be very wide sweeping change. This whole trend is going to happen, and we can continue this all the way through the 1980s and 1990s at the end of the Cold War. Then you'll notice there's another big jump again with a lot of these people being opened up from these old Cold War Soviet blocs as well. So we see changes in the Sunbelt and different changes in American demographics because of different external factors, push and pull. That's something you talk about in every single period, immigration or just internal migration as well, all over time, change over time. But when we're getting back to kind of how this sets up society at its time, we have a lot of immigration, we have domestic migration, but Nixon's going to win the election, and he's going to win it in a pretty dominating fashion. And when Nixon takes office, it is a huge change in the political realm. We have had very liberal presidents since FDR, who's first elected in 1932 during the Great Depression. So we're seeing a lot of wave of change. You can have Eisenhower right in the middle, but Eisenhower, although he's a Republican in name, a lot of his actions, especially domestically, are much, much more liberal. So as far as liberal reform domestically, there's going to be a huge cut and pull at that. There's going to be this movement towards conservatism because the liberal leaders right now, they're not working, right? And they associate that with the more recent failures, like with Johnson in Vietnam. We're going to want a more active foreign policy. So we want interventionism. Containment in Vietnam was proof that it was complete failure. It wasn't just a subtle failure. It was a complete blowing up in our face type of failure. So we're really looking to be much more interventionist, activist, right? We're trying to kind of bolster the American reputation around the world to make America this really strong force in the world. And domestically, that support's going to come from this so-called silent majority. There is a sentiment of this group of voters or political activists that are not in tune with this protest movement and the violence that they're seeing, the new youth movement of the hippies, the counterculture movement, right? They're reacting against that. We're going to see the 1950s very conformist. In the 1960s, there's going to be a counterculture heavily brewing, opposing kind of this conformity of the 1960s. And then this new Republican movement is going to be a reaction to that. And we'll see those layers as we start to look from a wider scope. When we're talking about policy all the way through from start to finish, we can keep looking back at where we've been. So our first president that we sort of looked at is we looked at Truman with his containment policy, and that was kind of the basis for all future policies. That's the backbone of all future policies to come. And he was semi-successful if you look at Berlin and you maybe look at Korea, even though he didn't particularly end it. Eisenhower did with his strategy, but Truman's kind of goal stays intact. And Eisenhower was very successful in using kind of this brinkmanship or willing to kind of roll the dice with mutually assured destruction, that we're all in this together, that he's willing to threaten these really big threats to try to make sure that people do not pull that trigger. But he's willing to go all the way up to the brink of war. He's willing to threaten the use of nuclear weapons, and he's trying to decrease the actual size of foot soldiers because of the expense, number one, but trying to move away from that sort of conflict, using these big threats to bring about peace negotiations or to stop the expansion of countries like China or the Soviet Union. And for the most part, it was semi-successful, but it increased our influence around the world. After Korea, we get involved in Vietnam. After events in the Middle East, or in Northern Africa, like the Suez Crisis with Egypt, now we have a heavy place, kind of a police force type presence in the Middle East. So America's role is continuously expanding. In comes JFK using that sort of flexible response style that we want to increase our nukes and our submarines and our first strike capability, that kind of being ready to fight and being more aggressive to try to go for that knockout blow to end the Cold War with the Soviet Union. But it's going to lead to a lot of conflicts and a lot of failures, whether it be what happens with the building of the Berlin Wall, whether it happens with the escalation of things in Vietnam, where the United States really gets a little bit more closely involved, or whether it be with the Cuban Missile Crisis, although he is successful in solving it. But the Vietnam story is going to have the longer trend, and we're going to see that thrown into the Johnson administration, who's going to continue that heightened response, that attempt to kind of blow them out of the water with our industry, but it's going to not be very successful. And so trying to distance himself and trying to find another way to end this communist threat around the world comes Nixon. And Nixon's policy is going to be something called détente. Détente is a French word meaning the lessening of tensions. And usually when I think of the French, especially the French in the 1900s, they're not very good in wars. They're not very good in the whole fighting thing. So they're really looking for peace. They don't want to fight. They're looking to lessen the tension. Or if you want to break down this word like root word wise, right? D, right? D-E, de, right? To lessen, right? To D, the opposite of something. Entente, right? Tense, tension, right? To detensify things, lower or lessen the tensions that we see in the Cold War. And we're going to see how Nixon's going to do that in a couple different ways and see if he's even successful in actually accomplishing that goal. When we're talking about Nixon, probably his biggest success is foreign policy. He's actually a really good foreign policy diplomat. It's going to, honestly, a lot of these decisions are mostly going to come from him. He's also going to heavily rely on his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, who's really going to help him make a lot of these big calls and big decisions. This détente plan has a couple different phases of it. Number one, the biggest issue that everyone is talking about is Vietnam. So trying to get a way to get America out of Vietnam in a more honorable way. The honorable exit is the whole plan for Vietnam. Find a way to get us out, but not make it look like we ran with our tail between our legs, so our reputation is still roughly intact, but we're still actually able to achieve that distance from Vietnam. We are going to use, hopefully, our trade to influence a lot of cooperation with the Soviet Union, sort of like the dollar diplomacy of Taft. And at the same time, another way that we can help kind of bridge communications with the Soviet Union is driving a wedge between them and their closest ally, China. If we can improve relations there, then maybe, just maybe, we can bring the Soviet Union to the talking table. So it's this kind of layered decision. There's a couple different things that he's trying to balance, juggle with, and deal with, but we'll look at each one individually. So when we're talking about our plan with Vietnam for Nixon, his number one goal is peace, but an honorable peace, not just peace, then we run away. He doesn't want this whole thing to be kind of collapsible and falling on itself. And so his plan for ending the Vietnam War is kind of, sounds like a made-up word almost, but this is this plan. We sometimes describe it as Vietnamization. That's the term that he's going to use. Vietnamization, making the war in Vietnam more Vietnamese and less American. What he means by that is, number one, American troops getting out of Vietnam is the paramount goal. That's like the end game. But also in doing so, we can't just completely pull out the base that's holding up the South Vietnamese resistance. We're going to slowly hand over these troops or this power to these troops in South Vietnam and slowly shift that responsibility from us to them as we are pulling out these troops one by one in these groups, in these waves. We're not going to do it all at once. It would lead to a total collapse. So that is our number one purpose, our number one goal, Vietnamization. However, that is the overall plan he's pitching to his advisors, or rather to the public. But privately, Nixon is really looking for other ways to weaken this blow of the North Vietnamese, the communist forces. We're going to be ordering heavy bombing runs. We are going to be running troops into Cambodia and Laos, neighboring countries, where we believe there to be what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is the supply line from the North Vietnamese to the communist forces fighting in South Vietnam. And we're trying to get these done. But remember, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is still the law of the land at this point. He doesn't need approval or even the consent of Congress. He doesn't have to address them about these issues. He can do whatever he needs to handle the Vietnamese crisis, whatever is done. And this comes all the way back from the Johnson administration. But these layers are really playing up. But because of us invading these other nearby countries and these heavy bombing runs, the civilian casualties, the public backlash is huge. Massive amount of protests sweeping all over the country. An example of a political manifestation of this change, and it's going to remove the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, is something called the War Powers Act of 1973. And what this will do is it will require Congress to give approval for the U.S. to send any forces into combat for more than 90 days. So it's no longer this blank check that the president has to do with as he wishes. It's a weakening of the power, of this kind of unlimited power that the president has. It's a movement towards restraining and pulling in that executive branch, giving power back to the legislative branch. And if there is going to be any military intervention whatsoever, Congress needs at least 2 days approval, 48 hours approval before that's actually going to happen. There is this kind of movement against centralized authority, and we kind of see where that trend is going. And the Vietnam War is really going to bring that to light. It's going to bring that presidential control downward. An example, though, of these protests that we can see something called the Kent State riots, or the Kent State's rebellion, and we're going to see it at other universities. Another example is Jackson State, but Kent State is probably the most famous one, immortalized in a famous song called Ohio by Crosby, Still, Youngs, and Nash. We're going to look at the musical side of this, but this protest aspect heavily with students going against representatives of the national government. The National Guard is going to be sent to squash these different rebellions across the country, mostly on a lot of college campuses, and in some cases it's going to get violent and cost the lives of American citizens, which is only going to fuel these flames even more. In 1970, there's going to be a huge protest by students that's going to break out. They're going to be meeting in the quads and on the grounds protesting the war in Vietnam, protesting the Nixon administration's choices. And the governor of Ohio is actually going to send in the National Guard to shut down this rebellion, disperse these students. It's going to lead with a lot of conflict back and forth. They're going to use tear gas to try to run these students out of there. Then some of them are going to be picking these canisters back. They're going to be chucking them back at the National Guardsmen, throwing rocks. It's going to get violent. And then eventually shots are going to ring out at these students. But we hear it kind of immortalized in these songs that are going to be used as messages, as propaganda, as political tools to really speak to the influence of the wider public. The hippie movement is going to be huge in this, and as I said before, that music realm. And this is a chunk of the lyrics of the chorus. Tin soldiers and Nixon's coming. We're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming. 4 dead in Ohio. Right? That idea that Nixon has these sort of toy soldiers, tin soldiers that he can move around as he wishes. Right? That it's like the people versus the government. And it's ultimately going to come down to the death of 4 different students. 2 were actually protesting. 2 were just onlookers. And this kind of call to action. This famous photo from the Kent State shooting, right? This girl down here screaming on her knees, right? That man in front of her has been shot dead, but she's not even a student. She's not even in college. She's 16 years old. She went to join this protest and this call for action, and it kind of speaks out to a lot of people. Another impact of the use of technology really hitting so many different homes across the country and really creating an anti-establishment sort of sentiment, this call for action, this call for questioning, and we're going to see that brewing. So Nixon is having to deal with the domestic home front and a lot of turmoil there while dealing with all these foreign policy issues. But when we're looking at the big picture, January 1973, the United States and Vietnam are actually going to agree to a ceasefire, and 2 months later, American troops are out of Vietnam, all of them out, gone. So that's a huge change kind of over time. 1972 is an election year, so this is before really, or right when he takes office for a second term, that Nixon's actually going to get that ceasefire agreed to. Problem is, 2 years later, 1975, South Vietnam completely falls. The North Vietnamese government and the Viet Cong forces are going to fight back, attack. They're going to take over the capital of South Vietnam, which is Saigon, and the entire country is now going to be unified, but not unified under a democratic government, unified under a communist government. And this was just more justification that this whole containment as just keeping it where it is isn't working. There's been some many major failures. Probably the biggest one is China, but also even this conquest in Vietnam. We have more troops. We have greater technology, right? We have this stronger, more superior army, but we still weren't able to contain this ideal and fight back against this kind of revolutionary group. So it doesn't really go too well in Vietnam, even though this kind of fall of Saigon is post Nixon's time. But when he's in office, right, he's able to agree to that ceasefire. This is just a picture of people fleeing Saigon and getting out via helicopter, as many citizens as possible. Another reason why immigration can occur is because of a lot of conflict and war in their area. So some people try to flee, get their children, or get themselves out of this country and flee to other places like the United States of America to try to find a better life for themselves or for their children. When we're talking about the wider scope of Nixon's foreign policy, the big one that a lot of people connect to is Vietnam because of the length of it and the severity of it. But there are other broad picture things that we can draw to when we're talking about the Cold War as a whole. So Vietnam is one aspect of it, but our major issue with the kind of the mother country, if you will, that we're trying to cut off is the Soviet Union, and that's where we're trying to do a lot of our agreements with. But one way that we try to handle that is by driving a wedge between them and their closest ally, China. And Nixon becomes the very first US president to not only visit China, but also recognize the People's Republic of China. He is able to successfully kind of create a bridge and a relationship there where some other presidents may have recognized to a small extent, but they've never actually been welcomed there. And begin to kind of go through that agreement. Now think about kind of when this sort of bridge begins. Back in 1950, 1949, Mao takes over, takes power, The People's Republic of China, this communist government, is set up. Truman's not going to acknowledge it. Eisenhower's not acknowledging it. There's not good relationships there. And Kennedy and Johnson don't really have any intention of doing that either. But Nixon is able to do that a couple years into his presidency. So this is after he's inaugurated for the second term. And by doing that, it's going to lead to a lot of broader picture things. We can use the Chinese to now get us closer to a bargaining table with the Soviet Union and get them to consider more diplomacy than actual violence. So it's really going to lower the Cold War tensions as a whole, because we can get to two of the biggest communist countries if we can get onto a good relationship there. The other way that this is super monumental, this is the very first time the U.S. actually has economic access to China, that this trade relationship is actually opened and appropriate. And that's a huge change over time that we can see today, where we have this massive trade dependency on the Chinese. And the way that this whole thing comes about is kind of funny. It's sometimes called ping-pong diplomacy, Nixon's relationship with the Chinese government, because the Chinese government sets up an international kind of scrimmage match between the Chinese ping pong team and the U.S. national ping pong team, which we didn't really have. So they put together an international team, different races, different ethnicities, and brought them to China for the very first time. And this became the backdrop at which why the United States would go there, and it allowed for a lot of communication and interaction with the Chinese government. There's a picture of Nixon meeting with Mao, and then them touring even the Great Wall of China. So there are little ways that being able to reach out to these governments, but created a proper relationship to bring the Soviet Union to the actual bargaining table. We can see that with the SALT treaty that's created. Now, the Soviet Union continues to go through leaders. They're not going to have these long-lasting leaders like you saw with Stalin, and Stalin is most certainly the number one most important Soviet leader to know. Then Khrushchev, because of the Sputnik satellite and the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are other leaders throughout the way. For example, Brezhnev is the current leader during the Nixon administration, but he's not what I would consider kind of one of the top three most important ones. But I just put that name there just so you have a little context in case you see it anywhere else. But the way that this whole agreement begins is we're able to get the Chinese to help us with this agreement, but we are able to sell over $1 billion worth of grain to the Soviet Union, who's severely struggling with providing enough food for their people. So we're able to manufacture that, sell that. It creates an economic business. So we're able to use our wallet to get to the table. And at that table, at that agreement, at the strategic arms limitation talks, or SALT, we actually get the Soviet Union to agree to a nuclear arms treaty to disarmament. So we see movements, and even though Nixon may not have been having the easiest time with Vietnam, he gets the troops out of Vietnam. He creates a relationship with China for the very first time ever, and he actually gets nuclear arms actually decreased in this movement towards a decrease of stockpiling these nuclear weapons. So that is huge change. The only kind of caveat is there are other weapons that the world is creating in different kind of high orbital missile tactics that aren't fully outlawed. So yes, there's a de-escalation of nuclear weaponry, but there are still other forms of weaponry that are created, such as MIRVs, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles. So basically you shoot them high into the air and they can have multiple missiles inside of them. So there are all these different little ways of kind of circumventing this rule. So are all Cold War tensions completely dissolved? No, but it's a movement toward that de-escalation. It's that détente in actual practice. So there's all these things that we do see, especially with the Soviet Union and China. These are more tangible things that we can actually look at. But there is a lot of foreign policy with Nixon that's a little bit more covert. So he's going to expand and use CIA in a very different way. So he's going to use these different covert agencies. For example, we are going to be funding different leaders in countries like Iran, South Africa, the Philippines, Nicaragua. But even though these leaders are brutal, and think of maybe like DM in South Vietnam, despite all this, we're willing to do it if they are resisting communism. And that's still kind of our sole, almost our sole criterion that we're using. It's going to even get so extreme that the CIA is going to assassinate the Chilean president. So these are all these just different ways that the U.S. government or Nixon is going to practice kind of detente, lessening these tensions by trying to remove these leaders or flip these leaders in a way that it's going to lead to this decrease or this de-escalation, hopefully. The other side to Nixon that a lot of people typically forget about is his domestic policy, and the reason why it's usually overshadowed by Watergate. But we'll talk about the big W word in just a moment. But when we're looking at Nixon's pitch to who he kind of portrayed himself as coming in as the person that's going to bring the country, that's going to unify the country to a more solid place, as he's going to be more of a moderate. And LBJ is much more of that the liberal side of the Democratic Party, being much more further left, is how he's really being portrayed and seen. And he's a huge increase in federal government expansion. He's very FDR like. He's on the same level of government influence and control. But a lot of these things that Nixon's going to try to do, he's going to allow these great society legislation to go in place. He's not really going to be pushing for a lot of many new ones. But one thing he is going to do is going to shift this control from the federal government problem to the state and local government problems, which are good in very progressive states, but in very conservative states or states that are really pushing against this social reform, you're not going to see a lot of progress there. However, when we're talking big picture, long-term federal government, the Supreme Court is going to be rapidly reshaped by Nixon. There are so many different justices that retire during this time period. 4 of the 9 Supreme Court justices will retire during the Nixon administration. One of them being the Chief Justice, Earl Warren, who oversaw a lot of these big cases like Brown versus the Board of Education. So the Warren Court is done. The Burger Court is now taking over. We also see a couple other different justices that are implemented or actually nominated and confirmed. And when they are, all of these 4 justices, based on the presidential nomination, are going to be much more conservative than they are liberal. So they're going to fall much more in that conservative line, and that's going to mean longer changes when we actually get to big Supreme Court decisions over the next few decades until there starts to be another change or another flip again. Other things, though, that we can point to Nixon creating some really good things of the Nixon administration. We see like the EPA, so we see again this continual movement of protecting the environment. We see things like OSHA, which help protect workers' rights, huge fines and penalties for workers that violate OSHA requirements and OSHA laws. It's a failed plan, but there's also this movement to replace welfare benefits with a minimum income across this country to kind of have that flat line. We see quotas for minority construction firms for government projects, which are very lucrative. They're consistent flows of money, so they're very, very well desired, but trying to sort of share the wealth. So it's not just a few couple companies that continuously are re-upping on these government projects. And then even ending the gold standard completely in 1971. If you remember, back in the Great Depression, FDR took the United States off of the gold policy, but eliminating that to try to create economic stability kind of as a whole. So there are a lot of different changes that Nixon has when we're talking domestically and wide sweeping. So Nixon is not just the guy from Watergate. There's a lot more that goes into him. He's a very, very popular president. There is a lot of backlash, but when we're talking about electorally, he's very, very popular, very successful in running. Now, this environmentalism movement, something that I have mentioned a little bit in this video, and I've kind of glanced over it very quickly, but there is a huge question and a call to the impact of human industrialism to the impact on the environment, as we saw in the Gilded Age responding to this, and we saw movements there. And we also see this after the 1950s and 1960s. And so there's this movement towards the type of chemicals that we're using in the same way. It's kind of like Jurassic Park. I always use this example, but Jurassic Park, we can make a giant park full of dinosaurs and let people run around in it, but just because you can doesn't mean you should. We have a lot of different forms of changes, and we're using all these different chemicals to try to increase production and manipulate genetics of fruits and vegetables and things like that. But also the impact of pollution, that there's a real call, and it's an impact not just on the environment, but on human health, public health. So there is a call to remove a lot of these chemicals. All of this change is coming in the midst of the civil rights movement, women's rights movement, LGBTQ communities rights movement, different ethnic and groups, civil rights movements that are all happening in the 60s. So a lot of this social change is wide sweeping. The other reason that I bring this up is this book, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, is an example of literature kind of summing up some public sentiment. Maybe you connect this all the way back to like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin back around the Civil War. There is this movement to try to capture the public mindset through literature, but pushing these ideas. Is this the piece of information that you have to know for the AP test? No, but it's a really good example. If there is anything on environmentalism, they have used excerpts from Silent Spring in the past, or they've made connections or alluding to it. It's a really good example for you to use for sure. There's a lot of different things. We can look at the broad picture of general trends of over-industrialization in the country, leading to concerns about the impact of the environment and pollution, but there are also individual instances that we can point to, like 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island is in Pennsylvania, and what happened at this nuclear plant was there was a radiation leak, and there was this concern there was going to be this massive nuclear meltdown, and that there was going to be this massive effects on all different areas throughout. Even though there wasn't this huge kind of nuclear fallout that some people concerned there would be, there was a heightened concern for things like this and the questioning of different types of energy sources. People began to question the use of nuclear energy and the safety of it, or the lack of safety of it, rather. So there's a call to change in that action. There's also a call for individual movement. So there are mascots for all different things. There's mascot Smokey the Bear for forest fires. There was a mascot in the 70s called Woodsy Owl against pollution. You can see a very cheesy, cringeworthy example of a commercial for our friend Woodsy the Owl here. And he would give his famous slogan, "Give a hoot, don't pollute." Don't be a dirty bird, and kind of this movement we're teaching children at a very, very young age to really practice and ingrain these things. And we also see things like the first Earth Day being celebrated. So there are some changes, some movements, societal changes towards environmentalism as we go throughout the late part of the 60s, but mostly the 70s and into the later generations. But probably the final thing we really need to talk about when we're talking about domestic changes and challenges that Nixon has is when we think about the Republicans, we think about economics more so than anything else rather than social change. And so economically, Nixon has a really, really bad hand. There's a massive amount of inflation that he's carrying over from the past two administrations, mostly the Johnson administration, and then a lot of money spent on the Vietnam War that he's trying to get out of. Is not going to really play well to the Republican kind of point of view, number one, or how Nixon wants the government to be run. So he's going to institute some classic Republican moves or Republican values, but there's going to be some disastrous effects. He's going to try to decrease government spending. He's going to increase interest rates to hopefully try to stabilize things, but there's going to be a recession that's going to hit in 1958. This is the first time a recession had hit in over a decade and a half, and so Americans were really freaking out. A lot of Democrats kind of dubbed this action as Nixonomics, as kind of like a Hooverism, if you will, kind of blaming this really negative plan towards the Nixon administration and their discussion or handling of this economic peril. But Nixon is going to respond very quickly with this huge freeze on wages and prices. There's going to be kind of like a protective tariff, a 10% tax on imports, and the Great Nixon turnaround, according to the Republicans, is going to be pitched into this picture. Now, what's important to understand when we're looking at trends is I don't have you memorize years. I don't think knowing every single year is important, but understand when elections happen. Right? Elections happen every 4 years. We had the election of 1968 that got Nixon elected. 1972 is the next election. So this is a really hot issue what a lot of people are concerned with. He's able to solve that issue. He's able to turn the tide on that issue. That we're actually going to see progress here. We're going to see change here, most definitely. It's going to help play into what happens in this election. And that gets us to 1972. So we have a lot of still domestic rebellion, you could say. There's a lot of counterculture movements really throughout the country. And the Democrats put up someone called George McGovern. McGovern was a so-called social outsider, and it was said by the Republicans that he supports acid, abortion, and amnesty, right? That he's this super, super liberal, far left-wing kind of candidate, that he's so extreme. And in 1972, Nixon's going to run for re-election. He's going to be extremely successful in this, right? He's actually going to win the fourth largest margin of victory ever. This is a testament to a lot of his successful foreign policy. This is a testament to his turnaround on the economy, his handling of the trend of getting us out of Vietnam, despite there being a lot of domestic unrest. However, the one thing that's going to grip the kind of future or the memory of the Nixon presidency is going to be the Watergate scandal. But just to show you how large of a victory this was, I'm going to flip to you, show you the election of 1972 map, just to show you how much red there actually was. Right there. So when you look at this map, there's only one state that McGovern actually wins. He wins Massachusetts, and he wins Washington, D.C., so he gets 3 votes there, so he's at 17. There is a libertarian that actually gets 1 of the votes from Virginia, but other than that, everything else is red. An example of an extremely blue state that rarely ever does anything else, especially in the modern era, besides vote blue, is Rhode Island, right? So if you look at Rhode Island's red, and that's a sign that things have drastically changed. There are only very few small pockets that really stayed with the Democratic Party. Everything else shifted to the Republicans heavily. He wins 96.6% of the Electoral College votes. He wins 520 of the 538 possible Electoral College votes. It is a thumping beyond belief that we've ever seen. There is a massive change in population with the Sunbelt, right? Remember, we see that change. And you can also start to see a lot of modern changes post-World War II in the 60s and the 70s. Notice the Electoral College vote count of California is now up to 45. Texas is 26 and rising. Florida is 17 and rising. And there still are some big states up in the Northeast like New York and Pennsylvania and Ohio and even Illinois, mostly because of Chicago. But there are shifts happening where these are changing, much more fluid, and the ones down south, like Florida, like Texas, and California, are going to continue to rise, even to this day, continue to rise. So there is a lot of change. There's a lot of movement over time. We see political changes over time, but the big thing we cannot leave a Nixon video without talking is going to be Watergate. So let's go into it. The one thing I want you to think about, and this is going to be a question you're going to have to ask yourself, and this kind of makes this topic much more argumentative when we're talking about the whole of who Nixon is. Does the Watergate scandal really deserve to overshadow, right, all of these accomplishments, mostly foreign policy accomplishments of Nixon? Nixon is able to successfully lower a lot of these tensions in the Cold War. But what deserves the greater notoriety when we're talking about the Nixon administration? Watergate or his détente? Right? Which one deserves a greater spot in history? And that's going to be up for you to decide. Now onto the big W word, Watergate. So Watergate is this infamous scandal in the Nixon administration that we're going to start to unpack, and we're going to go through the story of it a little bit. And you're going to look at really why do you think it's held at such high a level, and do you think it should be held at that high of a level? I mean, the way that we look at scandals today, anything that is extremely scandalous is given the kind of ending gate of something, whether you're talking about American football and the Patriots cheating and deflating the footballs. You have Deflate Gate that's put on this same sort of level. That's the name that it's given. It's comparing it to something at such a high level. So we'll kind of look and unpack this story as we go. There's a lot of good resources for you to check out when we're talking about the Watergate scandal. That's really going to give you the full scope of things and why it's kind of how this whole event actually unfolds. And a really good tool for you to check out is right here down below. This is a little 10-minute video from ABC News, but it really gives you a scope of how this whole break-in plays into the larger political realm, or kind of where it fits. So we're going to talk about it in our own way through a lot of photos, but this is another good link for you to just kind of support that understanding, give you an idea about how this whole story plays out. So we can kind of start with kind of who Nixon is as a person. Nixon is someone who's extremely paranoid. He has a lot of different people on his list of sort of like enemies that he believes are sort of out to get him, and he believes that the political circle is sort of trying to move against him. He has people on this list like Jane Fonda, famous American actress, or Paul Newman, Ted Kennedy, relative of the same Kennedy family that he lost to in the election of 1960. Joe Namath, famous Jets quarterback, David Shore, famous CBS News anchor, and Bill Cosby. Well, we might have been right on Bill Cosby, shouldn't have trusted him, but there's a variety of other citizens that he also doesn't trust. So he has that sort of paranoia, and that's that kind of mindset we want to have going into this story. Then we get to the actual term itself, the Watergate. The Watergate is probably one of the most surface level things that people don't understand. The Watergate is a complex, and you can see photos of it here, right in the Washington, D.C. kind of metro area. It is a hotel, but it's also home to many different office complexes. And at this office complex is going to be the home of the Democratic Committee, the DNC, and their candidate that they're going to be running in the election of 1972, George McGovern. What's going to happen at this is they're going to be a break-in at this hotel. It's a famous, well-known hotel in the general area. There's a lot of people that come through it, but you can get a lot of office space. And so what's going to happen is the federal government, eventually we're going to kind of unravel this story. It's all going to start with a break-in at the Watergate Hotel, which is where this scandal actually gets its name. So this whole thing really lays in the background of this election in 1972, and we already said that McGovern, this Democratic candidate who's running against Nixon, he gets completely squashed in the election. It's not even close. He is going to win the fourth largest margin of victory in presidential history ever. But what's going to happen is there's going to be a break-in at this headquarters, and people don't immediately assume that this is going to jump to or lead to this big case all the way up to federal government. It's just a break-in. But as information becomes unraveled in this, this whole break-in is actually going to be part of this very large, well-funded, federally supported, executively supported rather, attempt to gain information on their enemy, spy on them, kind of sabotage their campaign. And it's all going to be done by this committee, the Committee to Re-elect the President, or more unfortunately known as CREEP. And so CREEP is going to be the backbone of this scandal. Really, it's not so much this individual break-in that is the entirety of the scandal, but it's what kind of causes it. It's going to be the cover-up that's going to lead to Nixon's resignation. The cover-up is going to make it seem even worse for the American public, and they're going to really perceive the government as untrustworthy. And really, the role of the media in their lives is going to be increasing as the story goes on. Now, it may be very frustrating where how kind of in their face media can be, and the negative impacts of media, but really keeping the federal officials in check. Constant overwatch is really where the media's role is going to fit into society, and they're going to become a more trustworthy news source, and the role and the size of the government is going to be in flux from this point. It's going to continue on that downward trend. The story all breaks with a couple young journalists at the Washington Post, and like I said, the Watergate Hotel is right in the DC area, so the Washington Post, it's not far for them at all. The two journalists are Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. There's some young journalists that are sort of assigned to this case. Again, when it's happened, it's just a break-in at the hotel, and it's a little odd, but people go check it out. They don't expect it to be this big conspiracy theory that's going to roll up to the federal government. No one has any indication or no evidence of that at this time. As the story goes on, though, and as their investigation goes on, though, it's going to become more apparent that this is a bigger issue. The whole story and issue starts with these burglars. So 5 men are a part of this task to break into the DNC's headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. They're captured, And as they're captured, they're caught with security equipment. They're caught with a lot of money, organized serial numbers, which is pretty odd. But the other thing to think about is if you are breaking in to steal something, you're not usually bringing extra things to place there as well. So that starts to raise some eyebrows as they start to investigate who are you working for, who right is kind of the mastermind behind all this, and where does this all come from? That it's actually coming from, or they work for the federal government. And the story gets a little bit more complex as they dive in deeper. Lots of information is going to be disseminated throughout the public from the federal government. It's going to be very controlled, but there's other pieces of information that's going to be leaking from the federal government. And the Nixon administration tries to hire a group of people to try to sort out who is the, kind of the rat in the group, who is giving all this information out, where is this leak coming from? And they form this group that are known as the plumbers to solve all of those leaks in the federal government to stop this information from getting out. And they're trying to mitigate this damage. As this investigation goes on and they see this, they realize that it's not just a group of burglars breaking in this hotel, that they're a part of a much larger scheme. That depending on how far they trace this back, there's no way of telling how far this whole problem could go up. It could go all the way up to the very top rung of the federal government, go up to the office of the presidency, the president himself. And that is where the name of their novel, or rather their book that they publish and write, All the President's Men, is going to cover and release to the public. They are going to follow all of these people kind of under the thumb of the president and kind of how far it goes. How much did the president know is the ultimate question. They have a person who's giving them all this information, an informant. His name is actually not given out until the late part of the first decade of the 2000s, a man by the name of Mike Feld, but he was simply known under the alias as Deep Throat because of all the information that he had stored that he was letting them know. And the one major clue that he gave them, he told them to follow the money, follow the train of the money. And that went all the way up to the very top level of the executive branch. Now, Nixon has this problem going on. It's a slow burn. People don't really pay attention to it until later into 1973. It's this continuous addition. It keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper, this prolonging story. At the same time, he's also going to be dealing with the leaking of the Pentagon Papers, which are information on the Defense Department's handling and what the real issues are, what was actually happening in Vietnam. And so as people began to see that the federal government was lying about death tolls, they were lying about incidents, they were covering up about things, they were redacting information, they were skewing information, people began to really question the government as a viable source of information. They began to start to question anything they were telling them, including what was happening in this Watergate case. And so they start digging for more and more information. So the Watergate scandal really kind of comes undone at the seams as this report from Woodward and Bernstein continues to flow out. More and more information is released from this source, Deep Throat. But it gets even worse when the public find out something even more interesting to them, and Congress begins to ask for something. There's a discovery that Nixon has actually recorded conversations all throughout the White House, that he has recording devices, bug devices all throughout the White House. He knows what's being said even when he's not there. The problem is with all of this tangible evidence of what everyone said, this is going to be probably the most damning, the smoking gun, if you will. And ultimately, with this conversation, with this information coming out, people are really, really going to want this information. Congress is going to subpoena for it. They are going to ask and pledge for this information. They are going to issue legal documents requiring him to turn over that recording or all of these recordings, that if he has nothing to hide, there's no reason to keep them. But it's going to go all the way up to the Supreme Court, where Nixon refuses to turn over these tapes, even though Congress has subpoenaed them for it. And in that Supreme Court case, Nixon will claim executive privilege, that he doesn't have to do this because there are certain things that the president can do that a normal citizen would not necessarily be able to do. And it would not be considered legal if an individual citizen did it. He's doing it for the sake of national security, that there is this privilege that the president has that a normal citizen doesn't necessarily have. The Supreme Court will disagree with that. They will actually rule that Nixon has to turn over all of the tapes to the Senate investigating this Watergate issue. And in those tapes, he will turn them over. However, one key tape is going to have a big segment missing. 18 and a half minutes of a very key tape deleted, gone for history, cut up, burned, we'll never see it. And in that, it makes people question what was on that tape, what happened, where did it go? This wasn't an accident. But with all of this information that's turned over, the House is actually going to bring up 3 different articles of impeachment against Nixon. They're going to draft 3 different articles and be ready to vote on them. The 3 things that he is going to be charged with: number 1, abuse of power; number 2, obstruction of justice; and number 3, contempt of Congress. A little bit similar to the charges that we see against President Trump in 2019, 2020. So we have this kind of call and this question of power, really. So this is going to take our shift a little bit more into the future now, as we see, okay, what are the implications of this? How is Nixon going to respond? The Nixon administration is going to deny. It's not going to happen. The people of the United States need to know, according to Nixon, that their president is not a crook, and I am not a crook. I didn't do this. These are unsubstantiated claims. He's going to deny any role in the cover-up. He's going to say that the people below me acted on their own. They abused their power, and he feels guilty, yes, somewhat for that, but it wasn't him. It was the people below him that did it. And despite all this, people are going to really not trust Nixon. They're going to label him as kind of America's greatest criminal. And this political cartoon of him holding together these 2 tapes, I am a crook, and him kind of putting that extra piece in between that he's really trying to hold together at this team's. But this whole thing is going to collapse. His house of cards is going to fall down. And to make this even more complicated, what happens at this time is they start investigating all branches or all parts really of the executive branch. And Nixon's vice president by the name of Spiro Agnew is going to have to resign and quit because of tax evasion issues in his past, that he evaded taxes. And so Nixon is going to put up a brand new vice president before this whole Watergate thing completely falls out. And so they're trying to rid of people with this bad sort of impression. So Agnew, his elected vice president, is gone. The president then gets to pick a new vice president, someone that was not elected by the people, but they get to pick a new vice president as long as it's confirmed by Congress. And they pick a man by the name of Gerald Ford. Very important to remember. So Agnew is gone and Ford is in as vice president. Then in 1974, right, that following year, Nixon is going to resign. Before the impeachment charges will really go through, before there is even a trial, he will send this 1-sentence message to the Secretary of the State, Kissinger. Dear Mr. Secretary, I hereby resign the office of the Presidency of the United States. Sincerely, Richard Nixon. At effect at 11:35 a.m. He is done. He is out. He is the only president in the history of the United States to quit. He goes on to give a speech. Most people assume it's going to be about the Watergate scandal, and he tries to explain everything that's happening. You can go on YouTube. I encourage you to watch that actual speech. It's very, very quick, but the American public is shocked. This has never happened before and has not happened since. The people didn't really even know this was an option. You could quit, but he is going to resign. And now that he resigns, this new vice president that he picked, not the one that was elected, because Agnew resigns, Ford, this new one that he picked, now takes office as Nixon resigns. So Ford slides up to the presidency. And now Ford, the man who was never elected, then gets to pick a vice president who was also never elected. So it's the only time in U.S. history where we have a president and vice president that were never elected, that take office for the remaining 2 years. So they have a considerable amount of time for sure. And Nixon's kind of sentiment is that I'm doing this so that the country can go on. There has to be a time when you have to step away, and it's not something that I want to do, but something that I have to do. So he steps away. He steps down from the office. The last picture of him is stepping out onto the helicopter and writing out sort of from Washington, and that the American public really feel that he was never brought to justice. This was never handled properly, that this was never resolved. And so they are furious, furious, furious. Ford takes over, and so that new administration really begins trying to pick up the pieces of the tainted view of government, and we'll see how Ford does that in a much later video. Really, when we're talking about the scandal itself and the broad impact, 26 members of Nixon administration were sent to jail, but not Nixon himself. So a lot of people, especially at that time, had a severe problem with that, severe distrust of government. 26 different people were jailed, all because of connection to this issue. The press really becomes used as sort of a watchdog, as they like to say, really looking over the federal government, making sure that they're doing the right thing, trying to keep them in check. The judicial branch really becomes this increased importance to really people see that value in the judicial branch, and the weakening of the executive branch as well, the lack of concentration of power. So we're moving in a direction of decreasing centralized control in the executive branch that we've seen from FDR all the way through LBJ in the beginning of the Nixon administration, but then it starts going downhill. One, because of what happened in Vietnam, and two, because of what's happening here with Watergate. And this shift, right? This shift in balance of power, again, bringing it back to more of an equilibrium from the president over to Congress, and the Congress having a larger role in national policy in making these decisions. Really, we see this. We can go back to FDR. We could even see this go all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt, even, right? The biggest spike and the most consistent spike has been from FDR, but you go all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt at the beginning of the 1900s. We've been on this trend for almost 70 years straight. His increase of power and breaking up trusts and progressive legislation. So this is a huge continuity throughout most of the decade. Now we're going to see a shift, a change to the bottom end, mostly because of the issues in Vietnam, but also compile on top of that what's happening with Watergate. So there are massive effects that come from this scandal. You can see a lot of examples after Nixon, and I just like to post this up here. Not that you have to know every single one of them, but it made campaign finance reform from Congress to try to limit the power and the money funneled in to the executive branch. Easier for the Justice Department to investigate. Tried to open up and make the executive branch more transparent. Took away some control of the federal budget back to Congress. Passing the Freedom of Information Act, so it declassifies documents that the public can have it. Reining in the CIA to try to prevent all of these covert operations, that the people have an idea, really of a better idea of what's going on. So there's all of these ways that they're trying to make things much more transparent. You do not necessarily need to know these, but these are ways, tangible examples that we could prove that you're going to see throughout the next couple decades as we get closer to the end of this course and into the 2000s. So really, we talk about politics post-Watergate, and kind of where does Nixon stand, where should his legacy stand? But the one thing overarching that people talk about when you talk about Richard Nixon, the first thing that usually comes to mind is Watergate. We talk about that removal, right, or his quitting of office. But Watergate is the first term that comes to people's minds when they think about Richard Nixon. The one thing people know about him. And the biggest reason is this idea of corruption, this idea of distrust in the government. And because of that, the people are going to be much more skeptical. They're not going to be able to pass as much legislation or unbridled power. There's going to be a huge check by the public and by the legislative branch on the amount of power that the actual federal government, the executive branch more specifically, really holds. Because of this real tension between the president and Congress, after Watergate, in the immediate years, there's not really going to be a super strong leadership role in the country under the Ford administration or Carter administration. There are not going to be many super effective, strong kind of leaders in the foreign or domestic realm. You can kind of compare these couple presidents right after Nixon. to sort of what happens in the Gilded Age, where they're very weak power of the federal government, weak power of the president, not really getting involved. They're not able to because of the people's distrust of what's going on. They're not going to allow these things to go through until we get to the new decade, until we get to period 9, actually. We get 1980 moving forward, which is why that's going to be a super big turning point, that election of Ronald Reagan. And really, lastly, this discontent really in the 60s and 70s made it very apparent that things aren't all like hunky-dory and things aren't all fine in America during this time period, that there is a lot of counterculture sentiment, which is going to be our next topic. My next video I'm going to post is going to be all about the counterculture movement, the protest movement that you're going to see all throughout the 60s and 70s, the backdrop. So we are going to go back in time and we're going to see these things run together for us a little bit. We're going to see where does the counterculture movement, where does the social part really impact the political part of American culture? How is America responding during the Watergate crisis? How is America responding during the Vietnam War crisis? And then we'll get another video after that specifically just on the civil rights movement moving. So all three of these paths moving simultaneously and where America becomes so complex in the 60s and 70s. I know it's a lot of information, but if you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment down in the link below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Peace.